Hello, welcome to this week's Insight Live IT Experts Take, a show where we explore the latest trends and best practices around all things technology. I'm your host, Mike Moore, and today we're going to talk about a very timely and relevant topic revolving around data protection, ransomware, incident response, and specifically how we can plan for, prevent, and recover when a security event, whether it's ransomware or other, happens within our environment. So how we can maintain business continuity, maintain resilience, and what are some of the best solutions and the strategies that we can employ to really make sure that we're able to do all these things. So joining us with this discussion, I've got two experts in the field of data protection and security, both from Insight, Mr. Jeff Bozick, one of our distinguished architects. Good morning, Jeff. And Tom Hearn, VP of Architecture, and I'm glad to have you both. So, gentlemen, thank you and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, so let's do a couple housekeeping items first. So I do want to say, if you are joining us live, we have the opportunity to see all your thoughts and questions in real time. So love to keep it interactive. We've got Tom and Jeff here to answer all of your burning questions around data protection and security. So feel free to let those fly and we will try to answer those real time. One other thing, we did not intentionally pull the switcheroo on you. I am not Jason Rader, and we are missing our CTO, Juan Orlandini, today. So I will make a promise to Jeff and Tom that I will do my best impersonation of Mr. Rader, as long as you guys do your best impersonation of Juan, and I'm pretty sure you guys won't let me down. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right in. And Tom, I'll go ahead and come to you first. So let's talk a little bit about the why, and the why we're looking at data protection solutions and incident response planning and recovery methods is because of the cyber threats that are out there. Ransomware is one of those types of threats. So maybe you could give us a little, what is ransomware and how does it differ from the other type of threats that are out there?
Sure. So from a ransomware perspective, I mean, we look at data protection as something new and a new concept in many cases, or something that's changed aggressively over the years, and the concepts really haven't. So I think it's important for the team to understand that the basis of data protection overall has always been there, and the ability, the capabilities, the speed and velocity at which threat actors can move now. They've changed their tactics. It's their full-time job day in and day out to really go after organizations that they can make money on. They do their research. They make sure they're spending time in organizations that either have large cybersecurity payouts or a big enough revenue generation that they can get significant sums of money out of them. So from a broader concept, data protection itself and how ransomware is different than other factors, and what we see today is specifically around the rate at which threat actors can proliferate across environments. They've changed tactics. It used to be, log into an environment or get access to an environment, do a little bit of poking around and just kind of start encrypting things block by block. Very advanced tactics now, and how they can actually corrupt header files and storage platforms, be that a hypervisor, be that a database platform. Very, very targeted initial encryption on those areas that prevent essentially the rest of that file system from being used. So the speed we see in many cases with our customers, in under an hour in some cases. We had a customer last year that got hit, and 40,000 workloads were offline in an hour and 27 minutes. When you're dealing with that rate of change, and it's everything versus the speed of math on computers in the past to do block encryption, the turnaround time and your ability to actually restore that, particularly coupled if you have regulatory requirements to do forensic analysis, the overall time for a organization to restore has now gone up exponentially compared to maybe a couple VMs that got hit in the past. So that changes the speed and the bandwidth you need to push backups through a network. That changes your capacity planning for how effectively you can restore and where you actually restore to, whether that's cloud or on-prem or anything else in between. The time to restore that information and simply move that data by physics is a significant complexity that's been added with the speed at which ransomware attacks are occurring. So that's a little different than a former attack that it was just an exfiltration of a small amount of data or PII. This has changed from trying to sell the data they take to holding your data hostage to get money, which is actually an easier process. Bozick, you want to?
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, Tom, I agree with a lot of what you're talking about there, and I think as we look at the concept of things haven't truly changed from an overall strategy perspective, I think it's important to kind of highlight that that is still true. You think about we've always proposed and been big proponents of kind of the 3-2-1 architecture. Have three copies of your data across two different medium types, and have one of those off-site. That paradigm still exists today, even if you're trying to mitigate from large-scale ransomware attacks. And the ability to proliferate and encrypt and attack an entire environment very, very quickly, that does fundamentally change things, not only from a technology perspective, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those as we go here, but also from some of the soft pieces, the organizational pieces that have to change and come along with this. In the past, typically as you would think about building BCDR plans and response plans, even classification of data. Those weren't necessarily designed around the concept of my entire environment is now locked and I can't get access to any data. To your point, it was generally, I'm expecting it to either be some sort of localized disaster, that could be a loss of data center, someone deleted some files, some file corruption, maybe some sort of a cyber attack that encrypted a small amount of data, to now have your entire environment be offline or unavailable, and thinking about what does it mean to restore that. And so thinking about even just written policy, what is the most business critical data? What should you start to prioritize? Who do you call in these types of instances? You're going to need external help. So even some of those organizational pieces also need to start updating and just being augmented from your existing policy. You're not replacing your existing written policies and how things were done, and you're still have to mitigate for those types of failures that we talked about. But this does bring a totally new paradigm shift of how to start to think about what is the impact to my organization, what are the resources I'm going to have, and what is the actual priority and policy, and how am I going to get to the point where I can get my business back up and running as quickly as possible.
Jeff,
Yeah, and I
we
mean,
see muscle memory activities in a lot of our customers now that are actually pretty successful in restoration. I always like to call this out that that everyone's always had BCDR plans. They're rarely accurate and up to date, and quite frankly, usually when an incident occurs, it's either A, so out of date that the team just ignores it, or B, they're not familiar with it and they're in chaos response mode. So are pushing our organizations to test not only their policies, but the actual independent technology to understand if I click this button versus that button or run this command versus that one, what does it do? And I'm a huge proponent in our customers of doing what I would call point responses. So walk in one day as a leader and say, hey, Jeff, we just lost 3 VMs, restore them to this environment and see what it does, just to create that muscle memory on a regular basis. And we see the same thing in incident response management. The more the team is accustomed to dealing with these scenarios and how to handle themselves, their stress goes down and their ability to actually execute without creating more chaos goes up.
Right. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I mean, even to take a step back there, when we look at the anatomy of a breach, these are all the things that our clients should be doing ahead of time to have that preparedness and plan. But maybe for those who haven't done this or haven't gone through the exercises, as we look at the stage of attack, and I read a report the other day, it was the IBM cost of a data breach 2023. And you had mentioned that some clients, attackers or bad actors can get into systems and start locking things up within an hour and a half, but more targeted attacks, maybe state nation actors or someone financially motivated, they could be in an environment for up to 277 days from this report. And that's on average. And it's about 204 days to identify that an incident has occurred or a breach, not necessarily a ransomware event, but just someone's been in the environment, data's been accessed, the system's been accessed, and then another 73 days to actually remediate that or meantime to business continuity, basically. So what does that kind of look like? And what are some things that an organization could look at along the way from that chain of attack when initial compromise occurs?
Yeah, I can start on that one. So it's a really valid point to think about. And a lot of organizations, as they think about detection of breaches, mitigation, a lot of them rely on, network and security tools. And those tools are incredibly valuable. And they oftentimes are your first line of defense and your first area of investigation for discovery. But what's really interesting about it is, they're looking at things like network activity and things of that nature to start to understand where is this located, where did it start to spread, where might it exist today, so that I can go mitigate. But to your point, what if this was a very sneaky attack, something that was planted 277 days ago and is now just executing? I had a very large client that recently, unfortunately, had a cybersecurity incident, locked their entire environment down, lost a lot of revenue. And as we started to get engaged, they had already worked with CrowdStrike and some of their security vendors to identify and start the restore process from their data protection solution. And when I got in there, my very first question was, how do you know which backup to restore from? And they gave this answer. And so I started throwing out some of these scenarios of, well, what if this thing had been sitting there for 277 days? How do you know you're not just restoring from a point in time where this vulnerability's already existed, it's already planted, and you're just literally restoring it back, and it can be re-executed at any moment? And maybe that moment is tomorrow. Maybe they're going to wait 277 more days. So what's great, though, is a lot of the data protection solutions, some of the more modern ones, they're building capabilities into their solution to help also identify from the backups perspective. So as it's sitting there scanning your file systems and backing up the data, it understands what files have changed, what the rate of changes are. It can start to provide, using some AI algorithms and some other pretty cool technologies, to start to understand when was all of a sudden there's a huge amount of data that changed. That probably was potentially an encryption event. Or perhaps maybe they did just place that script or that malware piece on some server and let it sit there dormant. That system can detect, hey, there was this one file that's backed up in a location that we've never seen a file change before. So this is an anomalous location to have some sort of one little file change. Or maybe it's a common area, Windows scripts or something like that, a common area that these things get placed into. And so these types of technologies can start to really help you understand, hey, we believe this is a clean backup. And then they can sit there and test those backup sets to verify. You can even sometimes launch them into their own clean rooms, all within the data protection solution. It can create a clean room or a clean environment such that you can then restore. It can come in and actually do an analysis with your security tools to validate that, okay, this does not have that vulnerability, and the risk is mitigated. And this is a clean copy of our data that we can actually restore to. So I think this is a critical piece that sometimes people overlook or miss. And again, it's an augmentation of the existing security tools that are there, just to validate from a different lens, a different perspective that's actually investigating into the data, what is, we believe, a safe place to restore to.
So I'll add a little bit to that in the context of incidents, and loop that into why the data protection aspect is so important. Some recommendations that we have as part of that. So I have a couple scenarios that I'll share just from an awareness perspective of the complexity of threat actors we're dealing with, and quite frankly, the severity of consequences to individuals if they don't participate. So one is, we had a customer that had SMS-based multi-factor authentication. We're aware of a Western-based organized crime group that was working in tandem with one of the very common threat actors out there that went to a third-party cell phone store and actually physically threatened an employee's family with violence if they did not clone SIM cards. No one in their right mind would not do that at that moment, and nor would law enforcement tell you to go against that at that time. So that's something, that element of complexity and sophistication is fairly new, at least in the United States, from a Western-based organization. The second is working with a customer that they're a network admin in their organization had an unpatched media server platform on their home network, and the threat actors used a vulnerability on their personal home network to use bypass mechanisms they had in place based on IP address restrictions to actually gain entry into a customer's environment. And they acted as that individual for quite some time. And those two concepts go back to there's two very salient points that I would call out in that. One is I've always told my teams over the years, up through IT management on the customer side and now in sharing stories with our customers, is always trust your people, never trust their account. And I really, really mean that. A lot of people are offended when someone says, "Hey, we're seeing some weird activity here." It's not they did something wrong. You just need to assume things are not going right. And what that means in an administrative context for a team that's responsible for managing these platforms, who are oftentimes the specific targets based on LinkedIn data, Facebook data, et cetera, they know who the individuals are that will hold the keys to the kingdom, if you will. So you should assume that gets breached. So how do we go around that when we're talking in the context of data protection, when you have either organized crime or someone that's doing that level of sophistication and attack? You have to assume that account is hit. So we're
Yeah.
seeing the isolation of those platforms is super critical. It has to be Fort Knox. The ability to delete snapshots, copies, backups, etc., needs to have a more than one user authentication process put in place. The mathematical odds of two people getting hit at the same time as one are pretty minimal, barring more sophisticated activities that we've seen attempted but never successful. And that's super, super critical as we think about data protection. So not only do you have to make sure, in the context of what Jeff was talking about, you've got backups that could be bad or have
Mhm.
backdoors injected in those backups themselves for up to a year. You should assume that's the case. Use your platforms that have modern detection capabilities based on algorithms, AI, if you will, and use a concept of there will always be an attacker in that environment. So you're always isolating that they can delete those. So you do have an ability to restore. And then the last thing I'll add on is um, there's a difference between a restore of an image of an overall environment and an ability to forensically restore data that was a subset of that backup in the future. It is critical that our customers pay attention to that strategy. So go back to a fresh copy. Make sure that you have an unaltered copy. And then how do you pull data out of that altered copy in the future without pulling executables and potential backdoors that were inserted through that process? That requires significant complexity in how you look at application recoverability too, not just the raw data on a platform.
Tom, if I could, there's a cliche I created. I think it was probably almost a decade ago. There was one that says MasterCard had this commercial that actually played for a couple years, and it was something is worthless, but something else is priceless. And so to
Hmm.
that point, and again, this is back to circling back to our initial point that things haven't necessarily changed in its foundational concepts. I've always said backups are worthless, restores are priceless.
Yep.
But so many people focus on, can I back up my environment? It's a checkbox. Can I back up my environment? Is this data backed up? Am I hitting my backup windows? Do I have a process such that, if my developers are creating new workloads, we can understand where that data is so that it's backed up and we can understand that? Are we classifying it so we're backing up on the right schedules with RTOs and RPOs? RTOs and RPOs start with restore and recovery. That is the fundamental objective. And so it's not about planning, can you back it up? Obviously, it's important. You can't restore if it's not backed up. But the reason you're backing it up is in case you need to restore it. And we're talking about a very unique use case that creates interesting dynamics and demands and pressures on what you can and how you can restore. Size and scale we've never really talked about or thought about before. Interesting little details that you're talking about can I restore just little pieces of it or restore to clean environments? So focusing really on the restorability and the restore needs and how that is driven by these new attacks and threats and risks. That is fundamentally how you need to think about protecting the environment, what the solution that makes sense to you ultimately is. And one other point, Mike, that I don't want to forget about when you talked about, how can we prevent and how long things have been living in the environment. And a very common concept in storage and data protection nowadays is concept of immutability. And people think about immutability and it's sold by the vendors as this wonderful technology that helps you prevent from ransomware. I'm a big proponent of immutability. We, believe in it wholeheartedly as Insight as part of your strategy. It needs to be there, both from the storage perspective in some capacity, whether it's snapshots or some sort of storage for, high compliance data, as well as your backup environment. Meaning that once that data is backed up, that backup set cannot be changed. Even if there was a ransomware attack on it, it fundamentally cannot be changed. It cannot be encrypted. And this is a wonderful way to prevent the environment from actually becoming encrypted, allowing you to restore faster, mitigating the scope of which they can actually, breach you and attack you. What it does not prevent, though, is the initial placement of the malware in the environment. So getting back to how do you know just because you have these immutable snapshots in your storage array and they were not affected. So my real-time file systems, they are now encrypted. I can restore that snapshot of a 10 terabyte database in a matter of minutes. Wonderful. But what if that snapshot has the actual vulnerability in it? So immutability does not mean the active file system cannot have a file placed into it that then is backed up. And so if I restore, even if that backup is not changed by the ransomware event or whatever event it is, and I restore that very, very quickly, I'm again potentially restoring that vulnerability right back into the environment that can be executed again.
So Jeff and I are hitting around. We asked a survey question to the audience before, and we knew this, we would get a fascinating answer out of this. So the question was, how many data protection tools do you have in your environment? And we gave, I think, 4 options. We only got questions for our answers for 2 of them. So 42% said they had 0 to 2 tools in their environment, and 42% said they had 3 to 5, and then the remaining 8% was in a type scenario. So what I want to call out is what Jeff and I are talking through is it's not just restore this data right now as it was in a big blob of information, and we have no idea the state of that or how the data of that restore is relevant to the customers and data that may have been lost since the last snapshot. I would argue that in the 42% case, that's probably not fully accurate. If you take the replication, the snapshots on storage platforms, the actual backup itself and immutable storage, any application specific technology, failover technology, all of those things are very, very important to be taking into account. And it's very much so what Jeff and I are hitting on. I think that the answer alone is fascinating to me because that tells me where we need to focus on doing roundtables and whiteboarding and walking through the life of a restore, not the life of backup, as Jeff was talking about.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And when you first started talking, I was going to do my Jason impersonation and say there's a lot to unpack here because there's process, there's people, there's tools. And I mean, talking about the tools and the data protection strategy and the recovery portion of it, I mean, Bozic, you went right into it flawlessly. That's where I was going to head to next, is kind of the best practices and what we're going to do to manage and build those data protection tool sets in your environment very deliberately, and the importance of taking advantage of the full stack of that. So you had alluded to earlier best practices, the different locations, the media types, and what the 3-3-2-1 rule. I'm dyslexic, so okay, I got it right. So I mean, maybe you could dive into that and some of those best practices that when we're doing that restoral, how are we knowing we're getting to that right restore point where we're not compromising the environment and reintroducing the risk or that vulnerability that was already there?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think, again, a lot of these concepts that we'll talk about right now, you might already have in place or things you might have already thought about because they haven't necessarily fundamentally changed. But the concept is you obviously need multiple copies of your data in case, as one's getting compromised, keeping in mind that your active file system, consider that as a copy of your data. So as you think about having those multiple copies, this is where the concept of immutability starts to come in, is some of those copies of data need to be immutable. They need to be on some sort of storage medium or data protection medium that is unchangeable. That could even mean tape. And we'll talk about that's actually the one, which is the offsite copy. And so as you think then about the 2 of the 3-2-1 concept is multiple types of medium. Again, any one given type of medium could be attacked. And what if the attack is on the software piece itself? Not to knock anything, but say SolarWinds or some of these other tools that have had some very public, unfortunate circumstances. What if that is the thing that actually becomes compromised, or some sort of API access, or getting back to what Tom was talking about, where if Active Directory gets compromised, which is a common attack piece, so that they can create accounts, create administrative accounts, and now they can get administrative access to that tool, that piece of medium. Now you are, again, in a very compromised state. You might not even know that you're in a very, very compromised state where now this bad actor actually has control of your system. So thinking about how that can be on different types of media, such that now if one becomes compromised, I have another. That could even be cloud storage versus on-premises storage. It doesn't have to be tape. It could be even replication. Tom talked about replication technologies. So how am I thinking about replicating that technology? And that gets to the one of having some sort of offsite copy. Again, if you have highly sensitive data that simply cannot be compromised, offsite tape is still a viable option. A lot of people laughed it off 10 years ago. A lot of people were saying tape is dead. And I know the three of us and many people within Insight kept saying, no, it's not. It's going to have, if it has a renaissance, because I don't think it ever necessarily went away. There are still always use cases where it made a lot of sense. I think ransomware is showing that there are many use cases where it might still make a lot of sense. Maybe it is some sort of offsite cloud storage. Maybe it's replication to another data center onto a different different vendor of storage, or again, your data protection storage different from your primary storage. So these are some concepts of how to have your data protected, how to have a clean copy. And then getting back to, it's the more modern types of solutions, Cohesities and Rubrics of the world, and some of the legacy players are really starting to build in the Commvaults, this, again, AI technology to help understand what is the cleanliness of my data. And from the data perspective, from the backup perspective, it's inspection of the data as it's backing it up. It can start to detect anomalies, understanding when it thinks the actual breach happened, when it thinks that malware was actually placed on what system, so that you can start to better understand when can I restore clean copy. And then alluding back to what Tom was talking about, a lot of these technologies, again, thinking about how can I restore into a clean environment such that then my security team can come in, run all the scans that they need to validate, and be confident that this is a very clean restore. Confidence is key in this situation. You have to have confidence that you have the ability to restore. All the things we're talking about leading up to this helps build the confidence that you're able to do it. Again, reevaluating those written policies so that now you have the confidence that you can actually execute in that moment of chaos when everyone's got cognitive load and the stress is really high and the demands are really high. And then how do you have the confidence of what you're actually executing on the restore side of it, that we are restoring a clean environment and we're not going to just be reintroducing this vulnerability.
Yeah, that's perfect. And that's what I wanted to make sure we touched on next too, is, I mean, the intent was to plan, prepare, and recover from. So, I mean, the tools component does a lot of that too, but the policies that you just touched on, Jeff, like doing tabletop exercises, the business continuity, disaster recovery, having those policies in place for what do you do when XYZ VMs go down, or when we can't access this data store, extremely critical. And I mean, are you guys seeing that out there when you're working with clients? What are some of the challenges that they're really seeing from a prepare perspective, but also from the recover perspective? So I think we've done a lot about the tooling, but what are some of the things they may not be thinking about when it comes to preparedness and recovery?
I'll start, Tom, then I'll pass it over to you. So the people side of it becomes a big piece that is, again, misunderstood just from a size and scale. When you're traditionally planning data protection and restores, your existing team typically has the bandwidth to be able to do that. When you start thinking about these types of events, a couple things happen. Not only is the size and scale potentially your entire data estate, and so you need as many resources as you can to be able to start to execute on this. Your timeline just got incredibly compressed. The longer you are out without being able to restore your data and getting your business back, you're losing money, you're losing brand awareness, you're losing trust of your clients. So you now need to try to get this back online as quickly as possible. And on top of that, there are other pieces of the environment that are also being mitigated and remediated. The security side, the network side of things. Maybe you need to reimage some systems. Maybe you need to patch a whole bunch of systems because that's where the vulnerability lied. So maybe some of these people are also working with those teams or helping those teams. Maybe they're even part of shared teams. So starting to have as part of this plan, who am I going to call for help? You're going to need help. I can almost assure you, you're going to need third-party help to come in and help you execute this plan. Hopefully the plan that you already have vetted out and tested, to your point, and the process is there, but you just need resources to come in. So how can you be prepared up front to know who are the vendors like Insight that we can call to come in and help? What is the process for engaging them? If and when they come in, How are they going to get caught up to speed? How are we going to do this in a trusting way? You're now bringing third-party resources into your environment. That is, from a security side, something that they need to mitigate. How are they going to get you the access you need? You're now going to need generally potentially administrative type of access to start to do these things. So all of these considerations, having that pre-planned up front of how am I going to augment my team? How am I going to augment the people, bring those people in and have them be able to help me start executing quickly and securely and safely, I think is a big part of that piece.
So I'll just add to that, Jeff, and what we see in active remediation and response scenarios with our customers. And we have by design, Mike, we work with your team all the time. We work with all different teams, but Jeff and I's architecture organization, from a pre-sales perspective, we actually inject those teammates into the response process by design. For a couple reasons. One is they've lived these before. Almost all of our team came from the customer side and knows the chaos of either an emergency or an incident response, and injecting that team so that they are immediately looking for the types of resources we need internally to engage and have an ability to be agile in the types of teams we have respond depending on a customer environment. You need totally different skill sets for a completely on-prem environment versus a cloud environment. Almost everyone is somewhere in between, and making sure that is exercised on a regular basis. And when we're actually in those scenarios, it's typically our team where we focus our time and resources is as a customer is working through their regulatory requirements and actually verifying that the individuals in their environment are actually who they say they are. Oftentimes that engages HR, and it is a very long-standing process. But we're looking at what are we actually going to restore to without impacting forensic analysis? How are we going to get connectivity? How are we going to get capacity? All of those pieces that we would go through in a typical roundtable exercise to inject what we're seeing on a regular basis of here are the next 5 hiccups you need to be looking at because we're seeing this coming. That's the only other thing I'd add on top of what Jeff said too.
Yeah. And I mean, to both your points, I mean, we've seen remediations take from days to weeks to months. And I mean, having clients having that kind of staff on hand to do round the clock remediation, because like you said, if your data's gone or if your network's down, you're going to be having to do 24/7, rotating different teams to do that. So, I mean, having that third party support is definitely beneficial because maybe it's not a ransomware event, right? Maybe it was just destruction of assets you had. So your entire network infrastructure is down and you have to build it from scratch. Maybe it's the hypervisors. Maybe it is the VMs that got locked out or encrypted. So, I mean, there's so many different facets that it could go that it can get really complex really quickly.
I do find it fascinating that in almost every response scenario that we are in, the team that is responsible for data protection is absolutely the most overloaded team. You move that into teams that are managing the underlying platforms, so your storage, network, compute, et cetera, regardless if that's on-prem or in cloud. But the data protection team becomes that critical pillar that honestly multiplies your timeline or divides your timeline for a restoration. And add in the complexity of capacity planning for an entire environment being impacted versus a couple VMs. That's different physics you have to use on how you move petabytes of data in, let's say, a day versus, over random backups of differential backups over the last 6 months. Big difference in how you can execute.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot to chew on as we're wrapping up here. I mean, we're already at the 33-minute mark. Time has flown. So, I mean, what I'd like to leave anyone with who's still out there, I didn't see any questions come through, but if you want to continue the conversation, I mean, as Tom mentioned, we would love to have tabletops or roundtables, CXO type events to kind of discuss these situations with you. If you want to learn more about what we do at Insight, head over to insight.com. We have a ton of stuff out there and you can reach out that way to get some more information. But Tom and Jeff, I think this was a great topic. Obviously, you guys are very knowledgeable. You're having these conversations every day with our clients. So really appreciate you taking the time this morning. We didn't get a WAN impersonation in there, so maybe next time. But really appreciate you guys, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, all. Thanks, everyone, for joining.